Hey folks, welcome to Hobbyshire. My name is Chris and today we are making this. Now this project took a lot longer than I expected it to. What I predicted to be a 2 or 3 week project took me nearly 2 months. This is mainly because of the challenges I found myself facing during this time. Some were project related and some were personal health related. It did seem that once things started to go wrong with this project, everything started going wrong. At one point, I almost considered scrapping the whole thing, even though I had already put weeks of effort into that. But you will see that once we all get started. So, this is my first project in the Year of the Box theme that I explained in my last video. If you didn't see that, I'll put a link up here somewhere that you can click and check out and learn more about what this year's hobby theme is all about. This is a very ambitious project and something I have never tried before. With that said, we do have a lot to go through today and I've been so excited to share this project with you all, so let's make a cup of tea and get started. The first thing we need for this project is a box. I have this plain and simple wooden craft box. I will try to link this particular one in the description of the video, but you can use any box you like. It just has to be sturdy enough for everything we are going to stuff inside it, which is why I've gone with a wooden one rather than cardboard or anything like that. And it needs a lid. Well, I guess it does not really need a lid. But the whole point of this project is to have a beautiful little river diorama hidden inside a box, so the lid will, well, make it hidden. The first thing I did to the box was trace around where the hinges and locks are. This is because I plan to remove the lid to make it easier to work on the project, and I'm not yet sure what I plan to do with the outside, and if I end up gluing things to the outside of the box, I want to make sure I know where the footprint of the hinges are so I don't glue anything there. I took the hinges off and put them somewhere safe because I won't need them again until near the end of the project, and the last thing you want to do here is to lose them. With the hinges removed, I put the lid aside, and this gave me more freedom for working on the project without it getting in the way. I gave the box a quick scrub with a stiff wire brush to make the surface less smooth so that the sealant I'm about to use will stick to it better. I also wanted to get rid of a few splinters that I noticed here and there because I absolutely hate getting splinters and I cry like a baby whenever I have to try and get them out. For the sealant, I'm using this quick shade strong tone. You can use whatever you like. I'm just using this because I have it, and I originally bought it to seal Zombicide miniatures, but I don't really like it for using on miniatures, so it just sits gathering dust, and I figured, why not? I'll link this in the description, if I can find it, just in case you want to use it, but seriously, any varnish kind of sealant will do. The reason I'm sealing the box is because eventually I plan to put resin inside it, and this box has absolutely no treatment or finish on it. It's just bare wood and I don't know what will happen with the resin, whether it will make the resin soak into it, absorb it, or warp the wood and stuff, I don't know, so this is just a safety measure. On another note, if you are not planning to do anything to the outside of the box, this quick shade does add a really good old worn look to it, so that's something to consider. I only had a very rough idea on what I was going to create and was mostly just winging it. I took some blocks of black XPS foam out of my scrap pile that was left over from a castle I made before Christmas as part of a school project with my daughter. They fit in the box quite nicely, so I decided to use them, but I didn't like how low inside the box they were, so I took a few chunks of foam and started to glue them into the base like pillars to raise up the bottom, ensuring that the diorama itself would be sitting higher in the box, if that makes sense. This area is going to be completely hidden and built over the top of, and you will never actually see it, but I still couldn't help leaving a few doodles here and there. Am I the only one who does that? Like in the past, I've buried dead bodies under the ground of terrain tiles, or I've hidden treasure inside sculptor mode of cliff faces. Nobody will ever see it, and nobody knows it's there except for me, and it makes me smile. It's just a silly little habit of mine that I wanted to share with you folks. Anywho, I glued a thick sheet of cardboard on top of those makeshift foundations to lift the base level up just a smidge more, and then I glued the black foam pieces in place using Gorilla wood glue, making sure to leave a gap in the middle where the river is going to be. I didn't want the river to be too deep though, so I raised that up with some foam as well. Then I placed a bunch of heavy items on top of it all to make sure it dried nice and tight. You don't have to use wood glue, you can use PVA or hot glue or whatever. I just love this glue and it's my go-to for most purposes. Now, I don't just want this to be a river diorama. I want it to have a little secret hidden inside the secret. Secretception. I wanted a little story, so to speak, and I decided that I was going to add a few little miniatures. I bought these miniatures as part of a bulk order over Christmas when I decided to treat myself to a cheeky Christmas present. I got them from a little Etsy store called Future Forge Online, and they are so beautiful. They're well made and have brilliant detail. I've linked the store in the description of the video, and I will say that I highly recommend checking them out. I am not sponsored by them or anything like that. I bought these items from my own money and I just came across the store by happenstance as I was browsing miniatures online. But they have so many cool looking miniatures and their prices are just really affordable. Some of the cheapest I've seen. I was so impressed with them that I did reach out to tell them how much I love their products, and I told them I was excited to use the models in some videos, and they were kind enough to give me a discount code just for you folks. So right now is the best time to go check them out and treat yourself to a bargain using the discount code that I've put into the video description. For this particular project, I'm using some skulls, some cute little mushrooms, some natural logs, a tree stump, a super funky looking giant snail, and a licker from the Resident Evil franchise. I base coated them using spray primers. For the licker, I used Citadel Death Guard green, and for the rest, I used Chaos black. You can really see now all the little detail and why I love these products. Like I said, I'm not sponsored. I'm not saying this because I have to or anything like that. I'm just really impressed by this little family business. I put them aside for now and focused back on the build. I made some rock faces out of casting plaster. I didn't record that part because I went into the kitchen to do it. I glued them onto the base using hot glue just to quickly get them in place. I'm only using hot glue because I know I'm going to further secure them in place with modelling compound. But if I wasn't planning to do that, I would definitely recommend a stronger adhesive, as these will just fall off randomly if you just rely on the hot glue. This is how it looks once I have them all glued into place. In hindsight, the ones in the river turn out to be a bit too low to have the effect I originally wanted, so if I ever made this again, I would definitely raise them up somehow. Next, I took some modelling compound, which is just the same as sculptor mode, except this one is my homemade recipe, and I began spreading it everywhere, shaping the land how I wanted it to be. I don't know about you folks, but for me, no matter how careful I try and be with this stuff, I always end up just getting it everywhere. I tried to do it in my lap, thinking I would get better control, but nope. Still got it all over the place, including all over my clothes, up my nose, in my hair, and between my butt cheeks. Don't ask me how. Once it began to harden, which only took about 10 minutes if that, I used some clay metal carving tools to chisel and shape the mold in places where I felt it needed some more attention in order to get it to all blend together nicely. This is what it looked like when I was finished, and as you can see, I tried to have multiple levels to add depth and stop it from looking flat. I was really trying to represent an area of river deep in some untamed wilderness, and uneven ground along with various levels and dips helps to achieve that. I also did the same inside the lid of the box, getting some rock casts in place, adding modelling compound, and after deciding I wanted to make it into a cliff face, I built it all the way up but left a gap in the middle so that I can put a waterfall there a little later on. Keep in mind, this is not going to be one big continuous diorama, it's two separate dioramas inside one box. That's important and I'll explain more about that later. My next focus was to texture the riverbed. I started by making a puddle of heavily diluted Mod Podge. You can just smear a thick layer on there if you want. I just chose to make it a puddle so that it would be completely locked in place, because I get fed up of waiting an hour for stuff to dry, or even more than an hour actually. This stuff takes hours to fully set. And then you wait for it to dry and you go to brush it and it all starts falling away because it needed more glue. So I overcompensated here and I'm fine with that. I used a bunch of different textures to really add variety, like some large orange pebbles that I bought from Hobbycraft and some chunks of bark that I got from the local gardening store. I just scattered it all randomly into the Mod Podge puddle and kept going until I had completely filled in the puddle. I used gravel, sand, cork dust and all sorts. You can use whatever you like, just make sure to try your best to keep it off the rocks and stuff. I use a makeup brush to sweep it off every so often. Once it was done, I used a pipette to coat it all in iso alcohol. This will break the surface tension and allow the glue to get into every nook and cranny. Then I finished it off with a little more of the diluted Mod Podge on top, like a well-layered birthday cake. Leaving that to dry for a while, I put it aside and worked on painting up the miniatures. I started with the liquor, coating all the flesh in a shade called Beal Tan Green. I probably said that wrong, but oh well. I will try to be brief as I go through the miniature painting steps, as though I am pretty terrible at painting miniatures. I still act like a pro and have many steps to them, so it would otherwise be too long of a video. In the future, I will probably paint the minis ahead of time in a separate video so that I won't have to rush through the steps as much. When it comes to the liquor, I'm sure some of you are screaming at the video right now saying, "But Hobbyshire, the liquors are not green, they are red." And I know they are, but this diorama is my world, so I decided that I would just paint it whatever colour I want. And my thinking is this: liquors are monstrous predators, right? Like pure predatory lethal creatures. If one left the city and escaped into the wilderness, eventually it would evolve to its surroundings. And a natural predator in a land of green would maybe start shifting its skin tone in order to better blend in and hide. Much like how some hares, even though they are brown fared, they will completely change to pure white fur during snowy seasons. So I abandoned the stereotypical bloody gory red colour scheme and created a green mossy chameleon kind of scheme. For the logs and tree stumps, I base coated them in Rhinox hide. I covered all of it, but I wasn't really going for a clean, even look. I just slapped it on and it didn't really matter to me if I missed any areas and left that black showing through here and there. The snail, the little rabbits and the skulls got a very heavy overbrush in much the same way, only this time I used Mechanicus standard grey. Then I gave them all another overbrush using white scar. It's important to mention that I did not use a clean brush, so even though it's white, the brush still had the grey on there, so it went on as a very light grey instead of pure white. For the stems of the mushrooms, I used Wraithbone. I watered it down a lot to apply it thinly, as these are very small models and there wasn't much room to work with. Seriously though, it's better to layer on super thin coats to preserve the details on miniatures that are this tiny. I also made sure to do the stems of the shrooms that were growing out of the back of the snail too. Whilst I had the Wraithbone on my palette, I base coated some of the skulls in that as well. Next I used Morghast Bone on the rabbits, very thin down, almost like a wash, so that the undertones of those greys tainted the colour a little. The logs had dried by now, so I went back to those and used Mournfang Brown to do an overbrush. I just focused on getting it on the top layers, making sure not to get any in the crevices so that the darker brown still came through and gave the impression of depth. Whilst waiting for that to dry, I inspected the liquor. I took a moment to admire how nicely that green shade had, well, shaded the skin. I can't say it enough, these models are gorgeous, but alas, back to the task at hand. Once the Mournfang had dried, I gave the wood another dry brush, this time using Steel Legion Drab. I made sure to have even less on my brush than before, as I didn't want to cover up the previous layers. I applied Skeleton Horde contrast paint all over the skulls. It's such a quick and easy way of getting a bone tone, and usually anytime I have to paint bone I use Skeleton Horde. I was going back and forth with the miniatures. I'd paint one thing and whilst that was drying I would paint something else, then whilst that was drying I would work on something else, back and forth. It might seem chaotic, but it is actually a smooth process, allowing me to keep working without having to sit twiddling my thumbs waiting on stuff to dry. I used Methystone Red to paint some of the shrooms to give that typical bright red mushroom look that you often see in cartoons and pictures and stuff. Some of the other shrooms got Steel Legion Drab for their heads, and the rest got Bugman's Glow. When it came to the mushrooms on the snail's back, I wanted the snail to be a toxic, poisonous and dangerous snail, since it was monstrously big and a strange kind of predator in itself. So I took inspiration from the poisonous frogs of the Amazon rainforest, and I painted the mushroom heads in bright, vibrant colours, which I think looked very pretty. When they had dried, I went over them in a mix of similar contrast paints, just to take away the flatness of the look by giving it a multi-tone appearance. I went over all of the shrooms with Agrax Earthshade, because if you've ever seen shrooms growing in the wild, they're usually literally push their way up out of the dirt when they're sprouting, so they always look dirty, and I think the Earthshade adds a nice muddy look to it. Finally, I used some white scar and the back of my brush to add some white dots on top of a couple of the shrooms to finish off their look. This is their finished appearance. They're so cute! Rackar Flesh was used to give the wood yet another dry brush. It's a light brush this time, but I'm still covering a lot of the area. It's just that I have so little paint on the brush that even the areas I'm covering still have those other colours poking through, and that's exactly what I want. I use Elysian Green on the Licker skin. I say skin, but it doesn't actually have any skin, it's just bulging muscle, and I'm focusing on the parts that are, well, bulging. Like its juicy peachy cheeks, its shoulder muscles, its outer thighs, etc. I dry brush the areas like a kind of highlight, and you can just go with edge highlighting instead if you want, but I prefer the dry brush because, honestly, just because I suck at painting miniatures, as I'm sure you can see. I'm not very good at it, and my skills are extremely limited, and dry brushing is just easier for me. Next, I use Nurgling Green, another dry brush in the same areas that I dry brushed the previous layer, just with even less paint on the brush so that it covers even less of the area than before. Letting the liquor dry, I use Gulliman Flesh contrast paint on the main body of the toxic snail. I put it on thick enough to make sure it settled in all the recesses of that stunning detail printed on the surface. Agrax Earthshade was used on the skulls in the same way, mostly focused on getting it to settle in the nooks and crannies. And then back to the trees, I used Wraithbone to colour in any parts of the wood that wasn't covered in bark. A shade called Carrobear Crimson was put on the main body of the snail in certain areas to give a patchy look and add some variance to the shade of the skin. And then to finish off the skulls, I used Screaming Skull to highlight the edges, and I was able to put them aside with the shrooms. With all the dry brushing done on the wood for now, it got its main wash using Seraphim Sepia to cover the entire thing, including the areas that didn't have any bark on them. Whilst that was drying, I decided to paint the lips of the liquor in Canadian Flesh Tone. I ended up taking a few days break from the project at this point due to some ongoing health issues that I needed to focus on. When I returned to my crafting table, the box was ready for the next step, sealing. To do this, I used matte Mod Podge, as usual, and I put just enough black paint in there to turn the glue itself black. The paint part isn't actually necessary in spite of popular belief, but it's easier because not only does it allow you to see spots you've missed once it's dried, but it also acts like a nice dark base coat. I want to say at this point that drying times on this project were around 10 times longer than usual. This is due to the fact that it's been extremely cold where I live, often dropping into the -degrees, so stuff that would usually take an hour to dry was taking a day. Stuff that would take a day was taking a few days, and this stage actually took 2 days to completely dry. Using that extra long drying period, I got back to work on these gorgeous miniatures. I whipped out pallid witch flesh and used it to paint this trim, or skirt, or whatever you want to call it, on the toxic snail. I tried to be careful and I took my time so as not to get it on that cool patchy flesh that I had painted previously. I also painted the tentacle things and the eye tubey things in the pallid witch flesh too, just to give it all a nice clean base coat ready for some washes and such. The logs and tree stump was also dried and finished. The details on these things are just brilliant. I think the colour scheme is a good one, but I still think that it wouldn't look as good if not for the perfect surface texture there. With these complete, I put them aside with the shrooms and the skulls. Back to Mr. Liquor. I wanted his brain to be somewhat putrid, and so I started with Averland Sunset. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but my goal is to making it the colour of rotten human muscle tissue. It is quite watery because I put it on in 2 thin coats, and I had to be careful not to get it on his face. I know right now he looks a bit like Ed Sheeran, but trust the process. I wanted to dull down the snail skin a little, and I did that by using the Kislev flesh again and applying a quick light dry brush across the whole area. It's barely noticeable, especially on camera, but it just helps to blend those patchy shades together a bit better. Seraphim Sepia was my shade of choice for the brain. I put it on thick to get it settling into all those tiny little squiggly details. I put some on the hands as well to add some shadowy, murky areas, along with picking up a muscle segment here and there to get rid of that uniformed flat appearance. With the witch flesh dry on the snail skirt, I coated it in Plague Bearer's flesh contrast paint to ramp up that toxic style. It's a very grotesque tone and it works really well. I had forgotten all about the little bunnies. I mixed up 3 different colours to begin working on the fur. They were so tiny and my skills so basic that there really wasn't much I could do with them, but I still tried to bring them to life the best I could. I painted the tongue of the liquor in Screamer Pink, and as with most steps here, I thinned it down with water and put it on in 2 thin coats. Back to the snail, I used that Beeltan green again to wash over the Plague Bearer's flesh. The fine detail I keep mentioning did pretty much all the work here, allowing the shade to fall into the crevices and forge a grungy pattern, which was just brilliant. With the rabbits, I took away one of the 3 original paints and made a new dark mix, picking out some areas to add a dark layer of fur, mostly on the rabbit's back. Straight up Rhinox hide next, which I watered down and focused mostly on the spine and shoulder area. The process created a gradient that started light around the chest and got gradually darker towards the back. The brain of the liquor got a coat of Carabere Crimson that brought both the previous colours together, and the snail skirt got a wash in Reichland Flesh shade. I hit the little bunnies with some snakebite leather contrast paint, not everywhere, just picking out some of the darker areas to switch up the tone here and there, and the liquor tongue got a wash in Drucci Violet. Again, that's another one I can't pronounce. It was just to give that purpley tint to the otherwise bright pink colour. It was time to focus on the big swelling shell on the snail, and I started by giving it a base coat in dried bark. Whilst that was drying, I dry brushed the skirt in Elysian green to bring back some vibrancy after the previous wash. Next, I coated the shell in the wash of that Drucci Violet. It's an odd mix to go on top of a brown, but it works really well to give it a murky shimmer. With some pink horror, I added a few chunky edge highlights along the liquor's tongue to brighten it up, and I used Xandri Dust to base coat the finger and toenails as well as the teeth, before going over them with Seraphim Sepia. While still wet, I added some Agrax Earthshade onto that to give the nails the look of being dirty and not very well maintained. After all, it's not like Mr. Liquor goes for a manicure that often. I used a blue, I forget the name, to trace that swirl on the snail's shell. I didn't try too hard to be neat, as I knew I could tidy it up later. By all means, if you have a steady hand, try and do this part extra neat to save you that step, but my hands shake and tremble a lot, so I do what I have to do. I used nickel oxide, I don't know what the hell that is meant to be called, but I used it to paint thinly over the top of that blue. Then I used some more dried bark and Drucci Violet to tidy it up into a nice thin line. Ushabti Bone was used to edge highlight the liquor's nails and teeth, and finally the last step was to dry brush the snail's shell in Celestra Grey. The miniatures were finished. That took a long time, and like I've repeatedly said, I'm not good at painting miniatures, but I've done my best here, and I think they came out really nice, or at least to my liking. I mentioned at the beginning of the video that from here on out, when I include miniatures in a project, I'll paint them in a separate video because this just took up way too much time in this video. One final time, I will point out that I bought these on a whim as part of a bulk buy from a little family business on Etsy. I'm not sponsored by them, I just love the product so much that I reached out to them and I got that discount code for you folks. I know in this day and age how little businesses struggle competing against the big sharks. So if you feel like treating yourself, head over there, show them some love, support a small business and use the link in my discount to get some money off your sale. I don't get anything out of it if you do, I just want to help this business get some attention because they deserve it, and I want to help you all to grab a bargain because you deserve it. Before I forget, I did coat all of the miniatures in a matte varnish to protect them from chipping and colour fading, but that part is completely optional. Back to the main box now, the Mod Podge has dried nicely and this is what it looks like. To paint all the rocks, I'm going to start with a colour called Endeavour. This is actually a wall emulsion by Crown. I got a tester pot from the range that is just sitting around, so I decided to use it up. But you can use any navy blue as long as it's not too bright. We already have that nice black base coat from the Mod Podge, and I use a cheap makeup brush to heavy dry brush this all over the rock face. I'm sure you will have doubts about painting rocks blue, but don't worry about it. Remember that a lot of rocks have minerals and ores inside them, and this is what that represents, and when we are done you will barely see this colour, it's just to start laying down some depth. Once it's dry, I'm going to do another dry brush, this time using a bright red colour. Again, I'm trying to represent minerals and it will look awful after this stage, but trust the process and pick out some areas to concentrate on more than others to keep it uneven and non-uniform. Next step, I mix a dark grey with just a touch of blue from the first layer. I haven't cleaned my brush either, so when I dry brush this on, it goes on like a purple kissed grey. I go over everything with this. Don't forget to go over the Riverbed too if you want that to blend with it. Then again, I ended up not liking how I did the Riverbed and I repaint and texture it later, so it's entirely up to you. Later in the video, you will also see that I have multiple problems with the resin anyway, so you can't actually see my Riverbed in the end, which is annoying, but it is what it is. After that, I use a grey that is called Neutral Grey from Hobbycraft, and I heavily dry brush this all over it, and now it's starting to push back the blue and the red and the purple. You can really start to see just how those initially bright colours work well to develop an underlayer of nice hues and tones. Next I do the same again, but I use a very light grey and cover it all over. Don't worry if it looks too bright and stuff, because when we add washes it's going to darken it back down again. For the washes themselves, I use my homemade DIY ones. I'll put a link at the top of this video if I remember, but if it's not there, just check out my channel and you will find it. I use camo shade to coat the riverbed and a few areas along the bottom of the river verge where the rocks will be submerged. Then I use a brown wash in patchy areas, and then I fill in the gaps with a black wash. I'm doing this all whilst every one of the washes are still wet, so that they will blend together in areas and maximise the different shades and different colours while still only actually using 3 colours. It will take a while to dry, especially in the cold weather like I had, but once it's ready, dry brush it all over in a very light, almost white grey. I was careful not to cover too much and I had very little on the brush. I was mostly just picking out areas that would have direct sunlight hitting it. Then I did it again using pure white and touching upon even less area than before. I used a black and blue wash, or midnight wash as I call it, just to select a few areas on the rocks to glaze over to mix up the gradient some more. And then the same again with some dark green wash. Whilst it was still wet, I took some Indian yellow ink and watered it down and then stippled it into the dark green wash. This caused it to blend together and create a mossy highlight in certain parts. With everything dry, I use a dark earth texture by Vallejo. It was my first time using this and I didn't really like it. It textured great, but I would rather it had been darker, browner and more muddier, so whilst I would definitely buy it again for texture's sake, I would pick a different colour next time. I used a very cheap brush that I could throw away afterwards, and I spread this everywhere that I planned to have grass or mud. Once I laid it down, I stippled and pushed it around to texture it, and it held its shape really well. Like I just mentioned, I didn't like the colour, it was sandy like a beach, so once it hardened up I went over it with a deep brown acrylic. Then I used a brown wash with a touch of black in it to give it some shadow and depth. After that, I was finally happy with the colour of the ground. I'll link this ground texture in the description, as like I say, in terms of texture and stuff, it is really good, but I will link the colour that I would probably get instead of this one, because I don't recommend it for this particular project. To paint the inside walls of the box, I settled on a blue called Peacock Blue that I bought from Hobbycraft. I was going to go with a green instead, but I thought the blue would be good to represent the backdrop of a distant sky and stuff, so that is why I went with that. And I'm glad I did, because it does go really nice with all the other colours when it's finished. Ushabtibone was used to dry brush all over the mud. I'm planning to cover it all in grass anyway, but this ensures that any spots I miss will just look like muddy patches where grass hasn't grown. My dad used to build ponds in our gardens when I was growing up, and whenever we moved houses, he would always make a natural rock pool or something like that, which he would fill with koi. As a way of earning pocket money, I would always clean it for him whenever I built up too much grime. Sometimes he would use those plastic pond bases that you see in DIY stores, but most of the time he would make it more natural with rocks and gravel. And I noticed that with those ones, a light green moss would always end up growing on the rocks underwater. It was very slippery, and there was plenty of times during my childhood when I was wading knee-deep through the ponds that I would step on one of the rocks covered in it and end up falling on my ass, getting soaked and molested by the fish. I wanted to add that moss to this river to add some life in it, and I did so by first spreading some Mod Podge in a few areas and then using fine turf in a light green shade to sprinkle over it. I also put some on the cliffs in the lid, as you can see in this photo. It was during that stage when I decided I didn't like the bottom of the cliff, so I glued some scraps of foam in place and weighted them down. The plan was to build a verge on either side of the waterfall. If you are following along with this video and making the project with me, it is important I tell you at this point that I am not trying to get this diorama to match the diorama in the box. I'm treating them like two individual dioramas, as though I've got an open book where you can see two pictures, but they are individual, unrelated pictures rather than just one big picture stretched across 2 pages. I'm telling you this because it means that I don't have to make sure any of this flows with a diorama in the box. Like, if I was making them match, I would have to ensure that the position of the waterfall would align with the river down in the box and stuff like that. But I'm centering the waterfall, which means it will not sit aligned over the river itself. But that doesn't matter because I'm not trying to make them match. Hope that makes sense to you, because I do have a bad habit of over-explaining things. When those bits of foam have dried in place, I covered them with a modelling compound and then painted them up to match the rest of the rocks. I added the mud texture and I painted that up to catch this last minute change up with the rest of the project. I also scattered some flock and called it done for now. It was time to start flocking the main diorama, and I started by stippling Mod Podge everywhere that I planned to put the flock. I have a particular system for flocking that I feel works really well. I'll go over it briefly here, but if you want me to make a video going into more detail about how I flock, leave a comment on this video and let me know and I can arrange that. I start with a mix of fine light flock in a couple of different tones, and I put this wherever I want the brightest areas to be. Then I switch to a dark flock to sprinkle everywhere I want shadows to be. Then I use a medium flock to fill the gaps in between. I get it nice and wet with a layer of iso alcohol that will break the surface tension, and then some watered down Mod Podge goes on top of that. The reason I kind of go overboard here is because I want to really soak the flock to reactivate the paint colour in them so that it will all blend together in a more realistic fashion. I finish off by sprinkling some coarse, clumpier flock in various colours over the top of it all. I took this opportunity to press all the miniatures into place so that once the flock and glue dries, it will cement them all solid into position. I know some people would leave it until the very end to place the miniatures, but I wanted to stick them in place now because when I begin to add tufts and static grass, I'll be able to see where they are and design the layout around them. Just like with the flocking, I have a particular system when it comes to laying static grass, and I can make a video about that too if it's something you folks want. Basically, I start with a layer of Mod Podge again, and then I use some 4mm straw colour grass. I use my fingers to sprinkle this into place, and then I flatten it down and push it around with a brush. I'm doing this to represent particular thick areas of grass. If you've ever been in a field or something where the grass is really long and thick, You've probably noticed that once you start ripping up the grass on the top layer, you'll often find a lighter, yellower grass crushed beneath it and close to the mud. So that's what this is. My other static grass applicator broke, so I decided to invest in what many hobby makers consider to be the best static grass applicator in the world, the RTS Greenkeeper 55. If you want me to make a proper review about it, let me know. For the next layer of static grass, I mix some 4mm spring grass with 6mm wild meadow, and I lay it down all over the top and around the yellow straw after stippling more Mod Podge. This is how it ends up looking, and you can see here and here that the underlayer of the yellow straw has really made it look thick and natural. We aren't done yet though. I pick out some patches around the edge of it and I use some 7mm mid-green to add some variance to height and density. This is where I decided that I really didn't like the look of the riverbed. My original idea just wasn't working for me, and that's okay. Please don't think that when you make something, you have to get it perfect the first time, every time, because you don't. It's your build, your creation, and you don't have anything to prove to anyone, so if you do something and then later decide that it's poo, or you don't like it, just change it however you want. This was too green and overgrown for me, so I laid down a fresh bed of Mod Podge and then went with a more rockier look. Once I got it all in place, I covered it with more watered down glue and ISO to really make sure that it would lock into place, and I also dropped some black ink into the glue, which admittedly spread out a lot stronger than I thought it would, but it's fine, I can make it work. After working on the lid for a bit, I ran into a couple of problems. I glued some of the shrooms in place using Gorilla Super Glue, and as you can see here and here, the glue frosted the areas around it, which was only a minor issue, but still something to be aware of if you do the same. I can just hide this though with some clump foliage. Another issue I had was with this stuff here. I bought it from Temu and don't really know exactly what it is, but I thought it would work as some kind of bushy, viney, thorny growth thingamajigamy. But as you can see here, once I placed it, I gave it a wash in Agrax Earthshade to add some tone to it, and the wash went on fine, just like normal, but when I came back to it an hour later, the ink or pigment or paint or whatever it is that's in the wash had all clumped together and made some kind of gloopy tar in the middle. It did this on all the pieces of this particular product, and I don't have a clue why. Fortunately, I'm going to be mostly hiding this, so it's not a big deal, but I'll have to be careful if I use that strange product again in the future. Another issue I found cropping up was, though I had left this out of harm's way on my desk and not gone anywhere near it, I returned to see that some of the paint had flaked off, leaving white spots here and there. I fixed it by painting over it again, but it was a bit of a nuisance, and like I said, it wasn't like it had been knocked or anything, because my craft desk is out of the way in the corner of the room and nobody goes near it, so I have no idea why it happened. With my next step, I'm going to use this realistic water product. I've never used it before, so I'm not experienced with how it works, but I was eager to try. I stuck some strong tape at the bottom of the lid to make sure it would catch any potential spillage. I poured it into a tub and I used a brush to paint it on the rock face behind where the waterfall is going to go. I wanted to give the rock face a wet look, and it did work really well. I used more of the Gorilla Super Glue to start gluing some light green clump foliage into random places on the main diorama, and I also mixed it up with some medium and dark clump foliage too. I took out my trusty collection of tufts and plants and just went crazy. I added some cattails in the riverbed, and I just had fun with it, putting little bits of all sorts of different tufts in random places. I didn't think too much of what went where, I just winged it until I was satisfied with how it all looked. I also took some loose leaves and scattered material and sprinkled that in some areas too to indicate stuff like clover and wild heather. To start shaping the waterfall, I took some thin flexible wire, cut a few lengths from the coil, and then hot glued them in place as a foundation to build the waterfall onto. I covered each one in some super tacky glue, and then took some teddy bear stuffing and began laying it on to gradually build up the basic shape of a surfy, realistic looking fall. Using a syringe, I used more of the realistic water to pour it onto the teddy bear filling and let it soak into all of it. I also used some snowflock to sprinkle onto it in parts to build up the plumpness of the surf, and if anywhere needed more teddy bear filling, I just kept repeating the process over and over until I got it how I wanted it. This is how it looks once finished, and to be completely honest, this is only my second time ever using this method to make a waterfall, and the first time it was just awful. This time I'm actually really happy with how it looks and think it's nice, clean and realistic, even if I do say so myself. It did take days to dry and harden up though, I'm talking like nearly a week. I don't know what was going on. I used a 50/50 epoxy resin for the river, and I decided I was going to do it in layers to add some variety to the colours as you peer into it. I used glass paint to tint the colour, but you can use ink or whatever you want to use. You can see in this video I also threw some teddy bear stuff in there around these rocks to indicate some surf as the water flows along and crashes around it. I poured in the first layer of resin and all went well. I used this opportunity to stick some lichen in there to be weeds and stuff on the riverbed. I waited 24 hours for it to cure, and then I mixed up a second batch, colouring this one a bit more turquoise. I poured it into the box on top of the previous layer, and this too went well without any issue. After waiting another 24 hours for that to cure, I poured a third layer with just a slight blue tint to it, and this one went terribly, terribly wrong. This one seemed to create a very oily looking surface with small and large oil pools all over, both on the very surface and within this layer of resin. I have absolutely no idea why it has done this or what has caused it. The only thing I can say is that those first two layers were poured from the same bottles, but then I ran out and had to pop to the store for some more, so the third layer was poured from a new batch. It's the same product, the same brand and all, but new bottles, so maybe there was something in this batch, some kind of oil. I don't know, I'm clueless on the matter as I didn't add anything in between the layers that should cause this, or there was nothing in the cups when I was mixing it. It wasn't a new kind of paint, because like I say, I was using this glass ink thing and I'd used that on all three layers, so there was nothing new to this third layer that should have caused this to happen. I have no clue. I'm clueless on the matter, and at this point I was very frustrated and disheartened because it resulted in a cloudy, oily surface that just looked awful. The picture here really doesn't convey just how bad it looked all the way through this layer, and it made it very blurry and not very clear to see the bottom of the riverbed. And I confess that this annoyed me so much that I literally walked away from this project for a week and battled an inner war inside myself as to whether or not to throw this whole project into the bin. After a week of sulking and binge watching a bunch of things like The Gorge and Bailing Out Loud and Lucifer, I went back to my desk for the first time and decided to try and fix this horrible, horrible river. There was nothing I could do to undo it because, like I say, it wasn't just on the surface, but it was inside the resin too. So what was done, and the only way to fix it was to hide it somehow. The way I chose to do this was by using water ripples effect to make it a fast flowing river. However, as you can see, the moment I put it on, things began to go wrong again. Water ripples effect goes on clear, cures clear, and at no point should it turn white. But the second I put this on, it began to cloud up, and as I spread it out, it left white stain-like streaks on top of that very dodgy resin pour. This was yet another disaster on top of the original disaster. All I can think is that whatever went wrong with that resin pour left some invisible film or residue on the surface, and it had reactivated with this pour and had mixed into the ripple water effect. It just makes me flabbergasted when I try and think and talk about it because I don't know. It seemed to be sandwiched between the resin and the ripple effect though, and I couldn't brush any of it off. It seemed like them brush strokes had instantly cured and stained. I was exasperated with everything starting to go wrong, but I decided to see it through. The ripple effect itself took a while before it would hold its shape, but I just kept going over and over it every 10 minutes, stippling a texture into it, until eventually it cured and ended up looking like this. It still looked very cloudy and was not the effect that I wanted, but it had at least repaired the river by hiding all those oily patches and most of the phantom white streaks. It did mean I couldn't really see the riverbed anymore due to the cloudiness, but some things just don't always work out the way you want them to. For the areas where the streaks were still showing, I knew nothing less than a solid cover-up would get rid of them. So I used some white surf texture paint mixed with some snow flock to create water disturbance and surf. This was a lot more than I would usually put on. I just had no choice because of those streaks that would be seen through the resin otherwise, and it was completely ruined like that. So I had to work with it, and I put on a lot more than I usually would to hide that damage without completely destroying the project. It did mean I wasn't completely happy with the river, but this is how it turned out. Leaving that all to cure, I made some vines and ivy growth. This in itself would be a video of its own to explain in detail. And for this project, I didn't want to make this video longer than it already is, so I'll just show you a photo montage and leave that for a future video. But basically, I cut some twine to length I wanted, separated the threads of those pieces of twine, sprayed them with a spray adhesive, and then sprinkled on some various flocks, doing it again and again until I had it how I wanted. I did the same process for the patches of ivy, only I used polyfiber instead of twine. I waited for them to dry, and then I glued them into place in the diorama, which you'll see later during the grand reveal. For now though, the interior is finally done, and I focused on the outside of the box. With the lid screwed back on, I wanted to add a whole lot of texture to the surface, and I started by using some pattern stencils and some modelling paste, which I will link in the description. I placed this on with a spatula thingy in random spots, and it would dry 3D. I took some of this weird stuff. I have absolutely no idea what it is or where I got it from. I found it sitting in my drawer, and I don't know where it came from. If you know what it is, let me know in the comments. I glued this around the edge of the lid to make a quick blanket of texture there. I glued on some random corner embellishments that I had from a scrapbook kit, and then I glued some patches of this cross-stitching mat to some of the open areas. Next, I mixed some water and glue and started layering wet tissue paper on the surface and then pushing it around with a brush just to make some kind of crinkled bark pattern, which left a nice texture there. I also had some of these tiny beads that are part of a nail set, so I glued them on too. As you can see, I'm just having fun with it, grabbing all sorts of junk like these little plastic flowers which got slapped on, or some wooden dragonfly shapes, unicorn bits, beads, cogs, and random gems. By the time I was done, I had built up a layer of all sorts of junk, including abandoned jewellery, buttons, trinkets, and even a couple of keys. The next step after that was to seal it all in a coat of that Mod Podge and black paint which we used earlier. I won't show you me doing that again. The first thing to do after that dried was to heavy dry brush the whole thing in a metallic silver acrylic. After that, I used this pearlescent purple, which has a nice effect to it. Won't really see these layers, but they will affect the tone, shade and shimmer of the top coat, so it's worth it in my opinion. The magic ingredient here is this antique gold rub and buff. My dad absolutely loved this product here, and he used it on so many things. I mentioned his ponds earlier. Well, he had garden gnomes and ornaments all around his ponds that he used this stuff on. It's basically a rubbing wax with particles of metal in it. It gives one of the best gold effect looks that I know of, and we are going to use it right now on the box. A little of this goes a really long way. I put a small dollop on a disposable sponge. I say disposable because the rough texture is going to shred it up. Once I have enough on there, I rub it off on the tissue, exactly like you would if you were about to dry brush. And then I just began sweeping back and forth on the box, going this way and that. Sometimes I do go back and forth, sometimes side to side, sometimes up and down, sometimes in a circular motion. Just, well, rubbing and buffing it into all the texture. I did all the sides first, and then I worked on the top. As you can see, some of that silver and purple is still poking through, but that's good. Just take your time with it. You will see some people use their fingers for this part, and if you want to do that you can, but if you do, make sure to wash it off your fingers and hands as soon as you are done with it, as if you let it dry, it will stain your skin, and it is really hard to get off once that happens. Also, there are fumes with this, similar to if you was using a spray can, so make sure you have good ventilation and even wear a mask if you are doing it indoors. I let it dry overnight, and after that you can really buff it up if you want. The more you buff it, the shinier it gets. But for me, because it's on such a textured surface, buffing would be a pain in the bum bum. So I left it as it is since it looks awesome anyway, and instead I started to pick out some things and give them a touch of their own colour, like this leafy vines, which is actually some cloth fabric. And I just used some different metallic citadel and army painter paints to pick out individual embellishments and trinkets and cogs to give a variety to the different metals. Here's the finished result, and I bet when I was initially gluing all the bits on, you didn't think it was going to look as super epic as this, did you? Did you? No. With the finish line in sight, I let that all dry, and then I gave some areas a good wash in black and brown washes, and then we were done. Montage time. We went from this to this, from this to this. This was a project and a half. It was so much more work than I expected it to, but I do really love how it all came together in the end. If you are curious about project time, this is how long it took without drying time, meaning how long I was actively sat at my desk working on it. And this is how long it took if you add in the drying times, where I had to just sit and wait for it to dry before I could move on. Usually I don't think it would take this long, but like I said before, the cold weather extended all of the drying times like crazy. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, share it and all that goodness. Let me know in the comments what you think about it and if you plan to try it yourself. It's time for a well-earned cup of tea, so I'll catch you in the next video. Toodaloo!